This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I can't believe it's 2016 already. 2013, 14, 15, boom, 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 gone. At the speed of light. But I stay consistent. I bring you those great minds. I bring you those great guests. My guest today is Ron Friedman. He's an award-winning social psychologist who specializes in, near and dear to my heart, human motivation. His book, The Best Place to Work, The Art and Science of Creating an Extraordinary Workplace. Workplace, whether that's physical, whether that's with other people, or whether it's by yourself and not a physical location. Ron brings great insights. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Ron, I want to read a little excerpt from your work, something that I thought was really illustrative of the current day set of affairs. Quote, "The latest figures indicate that a full 70% of American employees feel disengaged at their jobs. Of these, 18% are actively disengaged, meaning they're not simply failing to meet their potential. They're acting out in ways that measurably damage their company," end quote. Boy, that's a mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is a sad state of affairs, as you pointed out. And it's happening because I think a lot of organizations are trying to be successful, but they're taking for granted all of this research that we have about the factors that really contribute to employee satisfaction. Basically, what it comes down to is three main psychological needs that we all have, regardless of our age, our culture, our backgrounds. And when we have those needs fulfilled, we're happier, healthier, more productive. So what are the three needs? Number one is the need for competence. So feeling like we're good at our job, but also having the opportunity to grow that competence on a regular basis at work. Second is the need for relatedness. So we need to feel connected to the people around us, feeling appreciated, valued, respected, all the good things that happen when we feel like we have close connections with those who we work with. And finally, the need for autonomy. So feeling like the work that you're doing is your choice. And so it really isn't all that big of a mystery why people feel disconnected at work. The reality is we have a lot of great evidence about what leads to effective workplaces. And now all we have to do is put that research to use.
Let me start with an example from me in just the last week. I was in New York City. And I went to Bloomberg's headquarters. I've been there before. I know what the layout was like, and I knew it gives off this fantastic vibe. And the guy that was meeting me to do an interview at Bloomberg, he was showing me where all the snacks were, and everyone was at this communal area where there's snacks and food. And I know in your work, you talk about Google, and you talk about the atmosphere that they have laid out. Why don't we talk from a big picture standpoint about the antiseptic world that some corporations have, where you're probably charged a certain amount of money each day if you're lucky enough to get a can of Coke from the machine, versus the layout and the thought process. And let's stay at a micro level, that the overall thought process that starts to get Google to make this decision, Bloomberg to make this decision, and some other companies, they say, we just don't care. Our employees are cattle. We'll give them a 15-minute break and that's it. Whereas I go to Bloomberg and you can feel the excitement. I've not been to Google's headquarters, but I have a feeling there's a similar ethos.
There's clear evidence that when you have employees who are happier, they tend to be more productive. And unfortunately, that insight hasn't made its way to a lot of industries. And so I've been to some of those workplaces. I've worked at some of those workplaces where you have to pay for coffee, let alone soda. I think it's a real misguided attempt at trying to conserve funds. And I think it speaks to one other point, which is that not only are we're talking about psychological needs and the importance of feeling like you have a close connection to your colleagues and feeling like you're valued by your company, but it's also a matter of our biological need to consume food as we work. When you think about these organizations that neglect to make that investment of offering people free snacks throughout the workday, access to yogurt, access to coffee, those are the types of things that prevent people from doing their best work. And I think it's a real mistake.
Let me tear apart one word in your main title, which is the word workplace. Let's even take a step back till we talk about these cool workplaces like Google and Bloomberg. How do you define the word workplace? I am essentially a one-man entrepreneur. I mean, I have people that work with me in close collaboration and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not a guy who's really a fan of employees. So I'm on the front line of the Tim Ferriss type mindset. However, clearly there is good stuff being done at very large corporations. We've talked about Google. We've talked about Bloomberg. We're going to dig even more deeply into those. But talk about the word workplace and what you mean when you say workplace, because it could be me in my environment and it could be somebody at Google, right?
I think the point you're making is a very important one, which is that once upon a time, work was confined to the office. And regardless of whether you work for yourself or you work for a company, the workplace is really anywhere you go now that you have access to a cell phone. And so that's just about anywhere. And so we really need to redefine what it means to create a great workplace. What we need to do is step beyond that mindset of work is what happens between the hours of 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and create environments that position people to succeed regardless of when or where they're working. And so you can't simply say to people, when you come into work, we expect you to work tirelessly at 100% capacity between 9 to 5. And then also, when you go home, we anticipate you responding to emails at all hours, really never shutting down and disconnecting from work, because that's what work means. And so really the advent of email has led to an expanded workday, and now work is just about everything we do. And so if you're looking for people to work to produce at a high level, you need to take that into account and actively encourage them to disconnect.
One of the things that I love that you do, and I want to read a slight quote from here. When your attempt rate is high, each individual failure becomes a lot less significant. In a surprising number of instances, it's the only reliable path to success. Taking it a step further also from your work, when Babe Ruth set the record for most career home runs and most career strikeouts in a week, he knew the two measures were linked. If I just tried for them dinky singles, Ruth told reporters, I could have batted around 600. Now, this is really interesting because this dovetails into my world of trading. I mean, we're not going to talk about that today, but I love the idea that you're mapping out as one of the many factors about success in the workplace is giving employees, giving people, giving yourself the opportunity to fail.
Now, I want to define what that word failure means, because for a lot of people, when they think about failure, they think about people who are incompetent or people who aren't trying hard enough. And there are, in reality, two different types. There are many, I'm sure there are a number of different types of failures, but two main categories of failure that I want to direct people's attention to. And one of them is the kind of failure that's caused by incompetence and people not trying. Those are the kind of the failures that we want to root out. Those are not the types of failures I'm recommending that we encourage. But then there are failures that are caused by intelligent risk-taking and experimentation. When you create an environment that tells people you cannot fail, you cannot make any mistakes, you might think that what you're doing is raising the bar for your employees. But what you're really doing is you're implicitly encouraging people to cover up their mistakes when they happen. And in fact, what you want to do is you want to actively encourage people to take risks and to experiment, because those are the types of learnings that enable them to be creative and to maximize their performance over the long run. We don't learn by trying to be perfect. We learn by doing something that's slightly beyond our current skill set and then using the feedback we get on our performance to improve the next time. And that's the type of environment you want to create if you're looking to have a team that's innovative, creative, and productive.
So we don't learn by being perfect, but what's amazing is before one gets to that first job or that first entrepreneurial endeavor, all schooling in America, K through 12, is about rote memorization, and perfection is how you're judged.
It's true. And what it does is it also discourages us from raising questions, because when we are rewarded for getting the answer correct every time, the reward structure tells us if you don't know the answer, you're doing something wrong. You see more and more educators being aware of this and actively trying to do something about it. And one example I give in the book is a professor at a liberal arts college who's actually encouraging students to take risks. And the way he's doing it is by saying to them, 5% of your grade at the end of the semester is going to be determined by your most intelligent failure. So in other words, if you haven't taken any risks and you haven't failed at anything, chances are you're not going to get an A in this class. You actually have to write an essay about something you got wrong and then investigate why you got it wrong and then what you learned from it. One way that an employer can learn from that example is the example of HCL Technologies, which is an IT provider, a global IT provider. And what they do is they have a leadership program for people on their team. And if you want to get into the leadership program, then you have to submit a failure CV. So it's the opposite of a typical CV where you write down all your accomplishments. At HCL Technologies, you have to write a failure CV where you list all the things that you have, all the mistakes you've made while working at HCL Technologies and what you learned as a function of those failures. And I think it's a great example of a technique that you can use and apply in your organization that doesn't cost you anything, but allows people to recognize that you actually value intelligent risk taking.
I absolutely love that. That is one of the coolest ideas I've ever heard. I'm going to do one for myself today, a failure CV, because if one is not learning from those failures, I mean, the failures are where you learn the most.
It's true. And if you look at the people who are the highest achievers, and I provide these examples of all these athletes who are at the top of their game. So you mentioned Babe Ruth. Another example is Kobe Bryant. He has more missed shots than any player in basketball history. In football, the player with the most interceptions in history is Brett Favre. And it's not just limited to the domain of sports. In fact, if you look at businesses that are ultra successful, places like Google and Apple, they're the ones that are failing at a higher rate than most of their contemporaries. So, for example, Steve Jobs, we often think of him as the one who helped bring the iPad and the iPhone into the world. But in fact, he also had a long list of failures before he got to that point. He failed with the Apple I, Apple II, the Lisa computer. In Google, we think about all of the success that Google has had, but they also have a good number of failures like the Google Reader, Google Buzz, Frugal, Google Wave. The point here is that if you want to be successful, you need to take risks. And it's because that's where the learnings are, and that's how creativity happens.
Well, as we talk about this, we have this conversation about the best place to work. I'm sure some people, and we're going to talk about this because it is one element, the physical environment, but the best place to work is so much about mindset and attitude and the thought process. And I think you bring up Apple and Google, and bring up some of these tech companies. My gosh, what is Silicon Valley so famous for? They're so famous for taking bets, for taking a risk. And they know that the vast majority of those bets aren't going to work out. Not everybody becomes Google.
Right. And I think that when we think about those types of creative ventures, we think about the big ideas. We think about the big name products that either are going to make you $1 billion or they're not going to make you any money. And I think that it almost discourages people from thinking about ways that they can apply that in their organizations. And creativity can happen really on the level of the customer service by empowering the people on the front lines to take some risks by saying to them, here are some guidelines that we've set out, but it's up to you to figure out what's the best way of treating our customers, or what's the best way of making a customer happy. If you only think about it in terms of large investments, then you're going to neglect the fact that anybody can be creative in just about any role, and it's up to you as a leader to model that.
One thing that you bring up as we're talking about creativity is the concept of flow. I've had the author Stephen Kotler on my podcast. He wrote a great book on flow, but I think I would love for you to discuss it a little bit too. And the notion, one thing I want to kind of quote from your work is, the musician knows the notes to play next. The rock climber knows the next moves to make. And being in this state of flow, my gosh, this is the ultimate for in a workplace. Because if you're in a workplace where you have to show up every day, and I used to call a friend of mine, this is so mean, but I used to call a friend of mine that worked at a big corporation, big auto company, and I would call him up and I would say, hey, how's the cube looking on the inside today? Do you have a little refrigerator in there? Is everything looking the same? What's going on? And I would drive him crazy. Now that's slightly mean, but he took the humor, but the idea of flow. Why don't you talk about flow in the workplace, just flow in general? Explain it to the audience.
What we talk about when we talk about this idea of flow is being in a moment where you're so enthralled with the work that you're doing that you lose track of time, where the feedback that you're getting on how you're producing is immediate, where people have flow experiences when they're playing video games, or they're playing chess, or they're rock climbing, or they're dancing. And that experience is actually more common in work than we recognize. So when we think about flow experiences, experiences, we think about enjoyment and being really into something. And you can have a lot of those experiences at work. And in fact, when Csikszentmihalyi did the classic study that introduced the idea of flow into the literature, he actually found that those flow experiences were more common at work than they were at home. So the question is, how do you create that environment that allows people to have those flow experiences? And what I talk about in the book is this idea that we can learn a lot from video games. And video games are so good at creating those flow experiences because they provide all of those experiences that we desperately seek in our work. And so what are those experiences? Number one, video games give us immediate feedback on how well we're doing. At work, we don't often have immediate feedback. So if you've written a memo, it's often weeks before you find out, was that a good memo? Maybe you don't even get any feedback at all. So immediate feedback is critical. Another component is having recognition when you do something well. And a lot of workplaces, you don't have that recognition up until the 6-month or annual review. And then finally, what video games do so well that I think a lot of organizational leaders can learn from is that they provide progressive difficulty. So when you start playing Angry Birds, for example, the first board is really, really easy. And then the second board's a little harder, the third board's a little harder, and then, by the time you get to the 100th board, it's almost impossible. We need that at work. Most workplaces have the opposite trajectory, where when you first start out at a new job, it's quite difficult. You're figuring out the culture, you're figuring out what's expected of you, you're trying to determine how to do it well. And then 1 or 2 years into it, it becomes really predictable. And when a job becomes predictable, that's when it becomes boring. It's when you start thinking, what am I doing this evening? What am I doing this weekend? Where's my next vacation to? We need progressive difficulty in our jobs. And so that's why if you want to keep people engaged, you have to actively think about, how am I going to continue to challenge this person in order to get them to be fully immersed in the work they're doing and have more of those flow experiences.
You just said that, how to keep the person actively engaged. As an entrepreneur who I really expect of myself and I expect of other people, how would you describe that instead of putting the onus on the manager or the leader, but the individual too? Because there's also got to be, yes, of course, me as a leader of the people that I work with, I have to motivate them. And motivation is a huge element of where you go in your work. But what about on the individual end too? I mean, there's also a responsibility for the individual employee or the young person that's starting out. They have to want this as well. They can't just necessarily expect the top of the organization to lead them perfectly. There's got to be some autonomy there.
Oh yeah, without question. And I think that's why I've written a book that's from the perspective of employers, but also for employees. How do you make sure that you continue to be engaged on a regular basis? And it's certainly a shared responsibility. I don't mean to put the onus on managers, but I think the reality for a lot of leaders is that they find themselves in situations where the people on their team aren't as engaged as they could be. We started this discussion by talking about the figures, which is that an alarming 80+% of employees worldwide are not fully engaged. While yes, the responsibility is shared, the reality for a lot of people who are managers and leaders is that the people on their team are just not fully engaged. So you need to create environments that are engaging for employees. And the reality is you're busy as a manager. You're busy with conference calls, you're on sales calls, you're in meetings. You don't have the time or the resources to worry about whether every single person on your team is fully engaged. So you need to create practices that you can put in place that position the people on your team to continue to be challenged on a regular basis. And I'll just give you one example of that. And that is to create a program that allows the people on your team to go out and buy a book that is in some way relevant to their job, let's say once a month or once a quarter. Give them a reading budget. And what that does is that exposes people to new ideas relevant to their profession and allows them to continue to explore new ways of doing their job. If you get one good idea from every person on your team as a result of having spent $100 for them to buy 4 books over the course of the year, that investment pays for itself. It also allows you to create an office library where people are continuously talking about and reading about new ideas that they can use to improve their performance. And it's just one example of an easy, fairly inexpensive practice that any company can use.
What I like about that too, and this is something you talk about, small, frequent pleasures can keep us happy longer than large, infrequent ones. So the fact that you're giving the employee something, even if it's as simple as a book, can really instill a sense of hey, I really like being here. This is kind of fun.
Yeah, and this is one of those insights that is unfortunately buried in academic jargon that a lot of managers are not necessarily aware of. And so I talk about how when it comes to happiness, frequency is more important than size. And so what does that mean? It means that having more positive, frequent events, like for example, going out, if you think about the typical employee having a cup of Starbucks at 10 o'clock, and then maybe having a catered lunch at 12 o'clock, having, some kind of nice thing happen at 2 o'clock. Those types of small, inexpensive events tend to boost their happiness for a longer period of time than having a blowout Christmas party once a year. And so from an investment standpoint, having those more frequent positive events can actually lead to happier employees.
You're a psychologist. Go back in time for me, because I've seen the people that have endorsed your work. There's some names that I really love. For example, top of the list, Seth Godin. And Seth is pretty, he's not going to put his name everywhere. So clearly a lot of people like what you've done. I would love for you to give me a little bit of background about how you even came to put this work together. And why do you think so many have come to like this particular work?
Wow, that's well. Seth it was very kind to have endorsed this book, and my background is that I was an academic for many years. I spent years teaching in colleges and universities. Got to the point where I was teaching full time and had achieved what I would set out to achieve. It was in that experience that I kind of felt like, I got into academics because I like to learn new things, and unfortunately, as an academic, you're essentially teaching the same thing again and again in various different classrooms. So I decided, I'm ready for that next big challenge. So I applied for a job as a pollster, where my job was to measure public opinion and then apply psychological principles to figure out how do we change those opinions. And in that experience of working in the corporate world, that was kind of my first big real job, where I came to see that, all of these insights that I took for granted as a psychologist, that I think a lot of psychologists take for granted, that everybody kind of knows because they're surrounded by other psychologists, about what are the factors that get people to be more motivated, more passionate, more creative, more engaged. Those insights were largely being ignored by most organizations. And so I give all these examples in the book about practices that we as psychologists know are not going to be effective, but managers continue to cling to because they've been taught to use them and they've been exposed to them over the course of their careers. And so I wrote The Best Place to Work as a means of taking literally over 1,000 academic studies, distilling them down and translating them into actionable recommendations that anyone can use regardless of whether they're a manager or whether they're an employee who's just entering the workforce. And my sense is it's resonated with people because it's actionable. I think a lot of us are interested in theory, just kind of intellectually interested and curious about it. But what it comes down to is, how do I take these insights and make them useful to me on a day-to-day basis? I was fortunate enough to have had both of those experiences. One as an academic, so I was aware of all the research and all the theory. But then having worked as a consultant, I realized that what people really want in a presentation is the last 2 pages where they get to see, the executive summary or the action items. That's what people really are interested in a big deck.
Actionable is a word that in a different context I've had fun with poking fun at on my podcast. But from your perspective, I see it in a different way. And you make me realize that the actionable is definitely useful. And let's go actionable for a second. Let's break this down to the physical environment. Let's just talk about something very concrete that people can think about. And they can think about maybe good places they've seen it done well. They've seen it done well. They've seen it done bad. For example, I think I've seen a documentary on Pixar, and their work environment is just amazing. Let's talk about things like design, color, sound, furniture. You talk about in your work, sitting near a window. Address all of those issues. Give me something actionable.
Yeah, there is a lot that we can talk about when it comes to design. So first of all, let me just take a step back and say our physical surroundings have a profound impact on our mindset. And it's often unconscious. So where you are affects the way you think. So if, just to kind of drive this point home, if you think about the sort of ideas that you have walking through a museum or being in a cathedral or being in a big stadium, and compare those with the types of thoughts you have in a claustrophobic elevator. And so I think very clearly you can see that you're in you feel differently in those environments, and that environment therefore impacts the quality of thoughts that you have. And I talk about all these studies, like, for example, there's research showing that ceiling height affects your level of thinking. So if you take people and you divide them into two groups, you take the first group, you bring them into a room with an 8-foot ceiling and you ask them to come up with creative ideas. And then you take the other group and you put them in a room with 10-foot ceilings and you ask them to come up with creative ideas. The latter group will perform better. And it's because when we're in that airy and unconstrained environment, we tend to have bigger thoughts. And so the takeaway here is that if you want people to be creative, you want to put them in a room with taller ceilings, and if you have them feel kind of more unconstrained and free, because that leads to bigger thoughts. And if you want people to be more attuned to details, you want to put them in an environment that's very different than that. So you asked me for examples of insights that you can make actionable. Well, one of the insights is that when you personalize your workspace, you tend to be more productive. And it's because you're more comfortable working in that space. You feel like you have shaped your environment, and that makes the work that you do, it puts you in a mindset of having greater control and feeling more optimistic about the work that you're doing. And so one way that organizations are taking that insight and putting it to use is by providing their employees with a small budget when they're first hired to customize their workspace. So one example of this is DreamWorks. Another example is Etsy. When an employee is hired by Etsy, they're given a small budget to customize their workspace, and that allows that employee to feel more comfortable in their space and therefore bring greater psychological resources to getting their work done.
Let me let you dig in on the window. And first, let me tell you my situation. So I'm in a situation, most of the time I'm in Asia, most of the time I'm in Southeast Asia, and I prefer to have a work environment where I'm at a tall location with a window, a wide panoramic view. Many friends have said to me, they've said, hey, why are you paying the extra money for the panoramic view? Why don't you save money and be down on the ground and you can have this and you can have that? And it always feels so claustrophobic to me. I want the view. I don't have the science that tells me why I want the view, but I'm hoping that you're going to tell me there's science for why my instinct wants that view.
I am going to tell you that there's science backing up that perspective, and now you have something to tell some of your friends the next time they question your judgment. This is actually one of the most surprising things that I discovered while doing the research, is that employees who sit near a window are better at staying on task. They're more satisfied and they're more loyal to their company. Why is that? And it's because exposure to daylight is healthy for us, and it lifts our mood. It gets our body producing more serotonin. It lowers our blood pressure, and it helps us sleep at night. When we're around daylight, it gets our body producing melatonin, which allows us to sleep better at night. And so there's all kinds of research showing that employees who have access to a window do better at their jobs. And in fact, you can actually predict how satisfied employees are by the amount of sunlight that's pouring into their workspace. That's, I think, a phenomenal finding, is that you can actually walk into any workspace, you have a pretty good sense of how satisfied people are by the amount of daylight that they're exposed to. And all of that is because, there are all of these biological reasons for it, but we also are drawn to scenes of nature. When we're around nature, we're more relaxed, and that enables us to perform better.
What about furniture?
Furniture is another interesting one. So there's research showing that you can actually influence how people think by positioning furniture a certain way. So when you walk into a room and the furniture is arranged in a circle, that activates a collaborative mindset. Means I'm going to work with others right now. And it's because of previous experience walking into rooms where the chairs are arranged in a circle that just kind of primes that way of thinking. But if you walk into a room where the chairs are arranged at an angular position, meaning that, like they are in most conference rooms, in that case, you're more likely to want to express your individuality. And again, it's because of previous experiences to those environments. So you can actually lead people to think a certain way by taking furniture into account.
One of the things I wanted to bring up in this conversation, I'm curious. I don't know. I see so many people want to talk about Mark Zuckerberg, probably going to be the first trillionaire or something to that effect. But I think it's a fantastic story. Just the ultimate success story. Of course, there's always a little bit of luck to something that much success, that much wealth. But hey, you still got to be there. You got to take action every day. One of the things that you bring up are some of the perks at Facebook. outline for us some of the perks at Facebook. What can we learn from Mr. Zuckerberg and his Facebook perks?
The perks at Facebook are very much like the perks at Google, which is to say that they are very generous to their employees. And so they've got all kinds of things like, and I don't remember if it's Facebook or Google at this point, but one of them has a rock climbing wall. They've got bikes everywhere for their employees to use. They offer unlimited meals that are restaurant quality meals. I think Facebook is the one with the candy store and an on-site dentist, conveniently enough.
So hold on, you get, my father's a dentist. So you eat all the sugar, and then when you've rotted your teeth out, you go next door and Mark gives you new teeth.
I don't know if he gives you new teeth, but he'll certainly have your cavities filled. But I think that there are a couple of things here. So number one is, I think that they have realized that if you take good care of your employees, that is going to be reciprocated. In other words, people are going to feel good. They're going to work harder because they feel like now they owe you something, but also because they want to stick around. And so I think from that perspective, that's important for other organizations to realize. Where I think a lot of companies have become discouraged is by thinking, well, I don't have the budget of a multinational corporations. Therefore, I'm not going to even attempt to make some of these things happen for my employees. And I think that it's the message for a lot of folks is confusion, frankly, around this idea that in order to create a great workplace, you need to spend millions of dollars. And I don't think that's the case. I think that, in fact, if you apply the principles that we have in all this research around the psychology of what makes for a great workplace, you can do it in a way that doesn't involve breaking the bank.
As I mentioned earlier in this conversation, your work is diverse, it's eclectic. There's a lot of different pieces that go into this subject matter. So if I jump around on you, you expect it.
Sure.
Interviewing for job candidates. This is something that I have to deal with when I get back to where I'm going in the new year. I've got to hire some new people for particular jobs. I hate the process of this. It's a nightmare. What are some of the things that we do very wrong when it comes to bringing new people into our world? What can we learn?
Well, one of the things we need to recognize is that in-person interviews are a disastrous tool for evaluating job candidates, and it's the one that most of us rely on primarily. And for one thing, it's because 81% of job candidates lie during an interview. So that's a huge problem, is that 4 out of 5 people are going to be lying during a job interview. And it's because they realize, not because they're bad people, it's because they realize that if I say I don't have the skills that obviously this person wants me to have, I'm not going to get this job. And so that becomes a game of like, how do I fool this person into thinking I have this skill because I need this job, because otherwise I don't have a paycheck. But even if you got people to be 100% accurate during the in-person interview, there are still multiple problems with that procedure. And for one thing, it's because we as interviewers are very bad at accurately assessing the people who we're interviewing. And it's because we make all kinds of erroneous assumptions about a candidate from their appearance. So we have all this research that shows that if you're interviewing a good-looking job candidate, you're going to assume that job candidate is more competent than they are because of their looks. We have research showing that if people are taller, they're assumed to have greater leadership skills than they actually do. And if a candidate has a deeper voice, then we assume that candidate is more trustworthy than they actually are. Those impressions are not accurate, and yet they happen on this unconscious level, and they affect the questions that we ask as the interview proceeds. So if I, for example, view you as being more extroverted than you actually are, I might ask you the question, Michael, tell me about the last time you led a group. Versus if I view you as being more introverted, I might say, Michael, are you comfortable being in front of large groups? And both of those questions get at the same underlying information, but the phraseology I use to get at the information impacts the answer that I receive. And so we have a huge problem with interviewing as a technique. And so what we really need to do is figure out a better way of measuring how effective candidates actually are at doing the job we want to hire them to do. And one of the recommendations I make in the book is that rather than making the in-person interview the first step to a hiring process, instead create some type of job relevant task that you can evaluate candidates on based on their performance. So for example, if you're hiring someone to redo your website, rather than looking at the resume and bringing them in for an in-person interview, have them design a landing page for you. If you're looking to hire a receptionist, hire that person for one day to come in and answer your phone, watch them for a couple of hours and see whether or not you like their performance. If you're thinking about hiring a salesperson, have that candidate come in and sell you on your company. That's a way of measuring their performance on the job they'll actually be hired to do, rather than simply assuming that because they do well in a job interview, they're going to be a good performer.
I must say, the last time I did a job interview, or I was being interviewed, I think I was 19. It was for an electronics store. They actually put a lie detector on me and asked if I had ever smoked pot before. That could have been subconsciously a reason why I decided I would have to only work for myself literally for the rest of my life. Sure, this is a true story. I did work for an electronics store and a lie detector test. Have you ever smoked pot? And I think I gave a political answer. It was actually frightening. What kind of a job is that? You know? Hey, talk about workplaces. And you make the connection, the narrative, the analogy, casinos. What can we learn from casinos about the workplace?
Well, what we can learn from casinos is that mindset is not an accident. So what do casinos do? When you walk into a casino, there are all of these methods that are essentially being used on you to get you to take more risks and to gamble more often. And the way they do it is by creating psychological distance between you and your money. So in other words, you're not walking around with a handful of bills as you walk around the casino. You used to have coins that were one step away from real money. Now you don't even have coins because they don't want you to feel that your cup is getting lighter as you spend your day at the casino in front of the slot machines. So now you just get a piece of paper that says how much money you have on it. So that psychological distance between you and your money is one technique. The other thing is that they bombard you with lights and loud sounds. There are scantily clad women walking around serving you alcohol. All of these are attempts to get you to take more risks and make you more comfortable with parting with your money. Casinos are successful because they have realized that they can create an environment that gets people more likely to take risks. And what organizations can learn from that is that, again, mindset is not an accident. And if you want employees to be happy or comfortable in their workplace, you can create an environment that allows for that to happen. And it's by applying some of the psychological principles that we've discussed so far for making people happier at work. And so we talked about frequency being one example of one way of getting people to be happier. Another example is learning from other psychological insights, like, for example, gratitude makes people happier. How do you get people feeling more grateful at work? Well, one way you can do that is by having a weekly meeting where people walk into the office together, and rather than being a typical staff meeting where people talk about what they haven't yet achieved and what they plan to do in the next week, have them talk about one thing that they accomplished in the last week. And people go around the room, and it's a way for people to learn about what's going on in the organization and how their role impacts others. And it also primes people to want to thank one another for their help. So in other words, if you're in one of these meetings, you are going to be asked, what did you accomplish in the last week? And so you might say, I put together this great podcast with Ron Friedman, right? And then you're going to thank your producer for having arranged for it. And so if you thank your producer, that primes that idea of thanking someone around other people in the room. And so what you tend to find is that as people are thinking about their accomplishments over the last week, they also thank the people involved for helping make that happen. And so it's a way of getting people to express their gratitude without it having the awkwardness of some of the other techniques that you might have heard of for getting people to be to feel grateful. Like psychologists often talk about having a gratitude diary. That can work for some people. For others, it might not. It can feel a little bit awkward. This is one way of making it practical and applying it to the workplace in a way that gets everyone feeling happier, and it leads to them also feeling more connected to one another.
Ron, another actionable one I would love for you to outline, especially the science behind it: taking an afternoon nap. Now, I know there's going to be a ton of bosses out there. They're old school. I mean, they just, it's just blank and vinegar. I mean, you got to be tough, and you sit there and you answer the phone and you grind through it. And, at the end of 5 years of working like that, we're going to talk about exercise in a moment too, but talk about taking a nap, and then we'll lead into exercise.
Yeah, this one is provocative. And I actually don't take the step of saying, okay, let's allow everyone to nap. But I do want to talk a little bit about the science, because before we dismiss that idea of it being ridiculous, how can we have employees nap at work? Let's just look at some of the findings. So what the research shows us very clearly is that we have a biological need for rest that is no less pressing than our biological need for food or for water. So we don't scoff at the idea of people needing to stop in the middle of the workday to eat lunch. And that biological need for rest is just as pressing, if not more pressing than it is today than it was maybe 100 years ago. Today, we're bombarded with information coming at us from every direction. And unless we allow our minds to restock their mental energy, we just can't perform at a high level. So when we're tired, which is what happens for a lot of people at around 2 or 3, we get less blood flowing into the areas of the brain that are critical for thinking, and we're less capable of forming long-term memories. So we're literally performing at a lower pace than we were earlier in the day. So oftentimes I tell people, the 1 hour in the morning, between the hour between 9 and 10 is worth twice as much time in the afternoon because you're operating at a much higher level. Unless you're taking time to replenish your mental energy. And one way you can do that is by taking a 20-minute nap. And so there's research showing that after a 20-minute nap, not only do we have increased alertness and a better mood, but it improves our decision making, and we're learning just as well as we would have earlier in the day. And so some organizations are actually putting that to use. So places like Google, Huffington Post, they have spots where people can go and actually take a nap in the middle of the workday, because they recognize that if you allow people to restock their mental energy, they're actually going to perform at a higher level. And it takes just about as much time as it would the average employee to go downstairs to the local Starbucks and come back to their desk.
Weight and exercise. I'm curious, not necessarily your opinion, because you've done the science here. You've done the homework. You've done the research. So I come back to the States after being away for a little while, and I'm in the States today. And I've been going to some yoga classes. I do yoga pretty religiously. And I've noticed, and I guess this is not hard for people to imagine, and I say this even though we're in the middle of an extremely PC world. When I'm in Asia, I don't see obesity. I really don't see obesity, especially in something like a yoga class. Now, a week into the States, I can go to yoga classes, and I salute some of these gals that are out there trying. But I'm really curious to what the science says about us in America, because we do lead in the obesity epidemic. What does this say about us in terms of our productivity with the extra weight, without the exercise? What is the science saying about that?
Well, one of the things I think it points to is the fact that we take for granted this idea that what we eat affects how productive we are. So the food that you're taking in impacts how you think. And so if you're eating foods that are heavy in fat content, for example, that's going to lead you to work at a much slower pace and not be as creative and productive as you otherwise would be. And so I point in the book to the research on exercise, and I argue that there's a business case for encouraging employees to exercise during the workday. And it's because when we exercise, we get more blood flowing to the parts of the brain that is responsible for active thinking and so decision making. And so when we have more blood flowing to the brain, we soak up information more quickly. We are better at retaining memories. We're more creative. We're put in a better mood, and that's critical when you think about all of the things that require being in a good mood in the workplace. And so again, creativity, but also collaborating with others. Just about any job you're in, you're going to need to collaborate with others in order to be effective, and your mood influences how effective you are. And so there are studies that show that when employees go to exercise during the workday, they get more done, they connect with their colleagues in a more effective way, but they also go home feeling more satisfied. And that's critical to their long-term engagement. And so one way you can apply that insight obviously is to have a gym at work. Not every organization is able to afford that or has the space for it. And if you don't, what you could do is actually tell your employees, if you're going to the gym, you can take an extended lunch, or you can come in late, or you can leave early, and get them a membership that they can use that's next to the office, so that it makes it practical for them to get that exercise. Because again, you're not doing it for them, you're doing it for you as a business leader. If you want people to be engaged and productive, you actually want them to get more exercise.
100%. It's for those people out there that are listening and thinking that we're being overly critical. There is something you got to say to yourself. Hey, we only live one time. You feel so much better. Everything in life improves, not just the workplace. and to really get down a path of trying to change the physical being of you. Boy, it's a huge thing to pursue. One last thing I want to bring up, Ron. Let's talk about the future. I'm not very good at predictions. In fact, I really can't predict. I can usually only predict that nothing will change. But how do you see the workplace? And I think, as we've talked about earlier in this podcast, the workplace can be a very large organization like Google, or it could be the one-man startup launching his new app. How do you see the workplace unfolding into the future? And as a kind of a little footnote to this, I remember when Netscape went public in the summer of 1995, and I said to myself, living in Northern Virginia at the time, right near Washington Dulles Airport, I said, wow, all this traffic's going to go away. No one is going to drive to offices anymore because everyone's going to work remotely. And then 20 years later, we've built even more office buildings. So why don't you talk about the future as you see it?
Well, one thing I think is clearly going to happen is we're going to get a lot better at applying the science and getting more analytical about what are the conditions that actually get people performing at a higher level. We no longer have to guess whether giving people the option of working from home is beneficial. We know it is. And I think more and more companies are going to start relying on data and stop relying on intuition. And I bring this example up when I speak at organizations. About 10 years ago, a book came out called Moneyball. And I'm sure, Michael, you've read it. It's a book that looked at what happened when the sport of baseball started applying analytics to the way they make decisions. And so before the research came onto the scene, baseball teams assumed that if you had a lot of home run hitters, you'd have a winning organization. And then they brought in some Harvard statisticians. They looked at the data, and what they discovered is that, in fact, no, it's not home run hitters. What you want is players who have a high on-base percentage, because those are the players who get on base and then eventually score runs. And that insight completely transformed the sport of baseball. And I think, like baseball, we're now at a point in organizations where we no longer have to guess what gets people performing at a high level. We have all that information. I think we just have to get better at applying it. So I think you're going to see a lot more organizations hiring statisticians to look at some of the factors that promote top performance in their organization. A second thing I would say is I think along those lines, we're going to get better at calibrating the tasks we do to time of day. And so we talked about how we tend to be sharper earlier in the mornings than we are in the afternoon. I think we need to get better at applying some of that time towards quiet, focused work rather than having collaborative meetings, which we're much better off doing in the afternoon where our energy level is a little bit lower. Just being around other people raises our energy level. And so having those meetings in the afternoon makes much more sense than using our best quality time earlier in the day. And the final thing I'd say is that I think you're going to see more and more companies encouraging their employees to disconnect. And already we're seeing lots of examples of this in top class organizations. So places like BMW turn off their emails after work hours because they don't want people emailing all hours of the night. Then there's a company called Full Contact, which you might remember from the book, that actually pays their employees an extra $7,500 bonus if they can manage to take a vacation without checking their email once. All of these companies are doing it not because, not out of the generosity of their hearts, but rather because they realize that if you want people performing at their best, you need to ensure that they have the opportunity to let their minds and bodies recover. And I think all of those things are going to happen in short order.
It's funny that you bring up baseball. This offseason, I think it was the Chicago Cubs. I think they gave a guy named Jason Hayward a $200 million contract as one of the richest contracts ever. When you look at his statistics, it was like a guy hitting 270. He hit maybe 13 home runs, like 60 RBIs. You look at these stats, they look pedestrian. Mm-hmm. But these guys had dug in deeper, and we're looking at on-base percentage and his defensive metrics. And they said all of that added up to equal that this guy is a superstar, but not in a superstar way that we would have measured in the 1970s, 1980s, or even the 1990s. Completely changed, and he just got a contract for the ages.
Yeah, and if you look at what are the metrics that we determine whether or not someone's a good employee, in a lot of organizations, it's face time. right? Someone who is first to show up, last to leave is what determines whether someone is a good worker. And we now know that having those types of behaviors, that's not going to position you to work at a high level. In fact, you need to take breaks. You need to take time to allow yourself to unwind, because often that's when the insights really emerge. And we're now working in an age where it's not about the hours we put in, but rather the quality of our thinking. If you want to create at a high level, if you want to generate great ideas, you actually need to step away from work.
Let me just fine tune that point, because you make the point in your work. How many great ideas come from sitting in the office cube, staring at your screen at your desk? The moments of lucidity comes, walking through an airport, on a street you've never been, listening to a piece of music. It has nothing to do with what we tell everybody it's going to be when you're going through K through 12.
Or stepping into the shower, right?
Yeah, anything. Walking through a door.
Now, in fairness, it's only after you've put in a great deal of time thinking about a topic that those insights emerge. So you can't just go into the shower and assume great ideas are going to happen, or walk through an airport and assume great ideas are going to happen. But you need to have balance. And if all you're doing is working all the time and checking your phone and staring at a screen at all hours of the day, you're just not going to position yourself to be the best you can be. And so I think that's an insight that anybody can take away, regardless of whether they're a manager or not, is that creating that balance of working hard and then relaxing, that's the way, not only to have great ideas, but also to make the work that you're doing sustainable.
One other thing here too, as we're going down this rabbit hole, my audience will recognize all of the influences that you've pulled into your work. And I think when I meet someone like you, even though we haven't met in person, it's looking at someone's iterative process over their career. How have they improved? You bring up Michael Lewis's Moneyball. One could bring up one of Malcolm Gladwell's books. We could talk about Alan Watts and Eastern traditions. Are you constantly improving? Because so many people, they get that college degree and they draw a line in the sand and they say, that's it, I'm ready to tackle the world. Whereas there's too much information today. You can't stop. It's an iterative process. And I think your work really shows that iterative process. It shows somebody who's been in there fighting to glean a new piece of wisdom, to keep moving the ball down the street, so to speak.
You know what? I think that is something that is true for me personally, but I also think it's true on an organizational level. And I think that if we think about efficiency, what is it that's going to make the people we work with efficient? That generally involves them doing the same thing again and again, because the more often they do it, the quicker they get. But efficiency is not the same thing as engagement. And if you want people to be engaged, you actually want them to be inefficient from time to time by taking the time and directing the energy to learn new things. And so I think that's a very important distinction that often gets overlooked. Efficiency and engagement are not the same thing. And in order to achieve engagement, you need learning.
The Best Place to Work, The Art and Science of Creating an Extraordinary Workplace by Ron Friedman. Anywhere and everywhere. You can find it on Amazon. Ron, where's the best place we can send people website-wise to find out more about you? Ignite80.com.
So that's Ignite and then the number 80. That's the name of the organization that I run. And the reason it's called Ignite 80 is because of the very point you raised at the beginning of this interview, which is that over 80% of employees worldwide are not fully engaged. And the goal of Ignite 80 is to reverse that trend.
Ron, thank you for your time. We could talk all day. Seriously, you touch on so many subjects, and that's what I was really getting at the very end there, is that the elements that you're bringing together to talk about the workplace, these are so many things that people are familiar with, and I think you are very creatively bringing them together to get people to focus on another issue in our lives that's important to all of us, which is the workplace.
I appreciate you saying that, and I have to tell you, one of the critiques I got, because we talked about endorsements and Seth Godin being kind enough to say nice things. One of the critiques I got is that it's too broad. And I have to say, I'm proud of that. You know, I'm unapologetically broad, and I look to bring in all kinds of insights that are relevant to everyone. And I think it sounds like you've enjoyed it for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Sir, thank you for your time.
My pleasure, Michael.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student, or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money. Trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.